The idea of the circular flow diagram as a way of looking at the economy was introduced back in Lecture 3. If you remember, that diagram had two main groups of actors in the economy, households and firms, and the households and firms were interacting in three main markets: in markets for goods, markets for labor, and markets for financial capital. The previous lectures have mainly been working through the idea of markets for goods and how they operate. In this lecture, we want to shift to the market for labor. The economy is commonly described by what is produced, but it's really equally valid to think about the economy as the patterns of the working people who carry out that production. I sometimes say the US economy is what happens when 130 million people get up and go to work each day. Now, of course, this idea of what is consumed and what are produced is really just two different perspectives on the same overall set of interactions. Just one is looking at the economy from the standpoint of what the firms make, and the other is looking at it from the standpoint of who they hire. Supply and demand is the key to understanding labor markets, just as it is with markets for goods. But there's one major difference as you work your way through the intuition. In goods markets, firms are the suppliers of goods, and households and individuals are the demand for goods. But in the labor market, individuals are the suppliers of labor, and businesses are the demanders of labor. In the labor market, instead of talking about the price of each different good, we talk about the wage or the salary that the worker receives, but that serves the same economic function as the price in the goods market. Just as there are many, many different goods for all different kinds of goods and services with different kinds of characteristics, the market for labor is really many different markets as well. And it has different characteristics for each worker. There could be a market for nurses, a market for firefighters, a market for all the different kinds of jobs. So when you're jumping between markets for goods and markets for labor, you do have to keep these differences in intuition straight. But if you can keep those concepts straight, then the two markets are analyzed in precisely the same way. So let's walk through it for the labor market. Demand for labor is a relationship. In this case, the relationship is between the wage or the salary paid and the quantity of work that employers demand as they're trying to hire people to make their products. A higher wage will tend to make businesses demand a lower quantity of labor, just in the same way that a lower price tends to make consumers demand less of a good. At an intuitive level, this ought to make some sense. Firms are trying to make money. If the cost of labor goes up and up, firms will try to find some ways to cut back on labor. And perhaps they'll be able to substitute some kind of machinery or physical capital, or figure out another method of producing whatever it is they're producing. Well, just how much will an increase in wages reduce the quantity of labor demanded? That will depend, of course, on the elasticity, which works in labor markets just like it does in goods markets. Some firms will have a fairly inelastic demand for labor. That is, a 10% rise in wages would lead to a less than 10% drop in the quantity of labor hired. Some firms will have an elastic demand for labor. A 10% rise in wages would lead to a more than 10% drop in the quantity of labor hired. In many cases, demand for labor will be fairly inelastic in the short run. Firms sort of have hired who they've hired, they're going to work with who they've got, but potentially the demand for labor can be much more elastic in the long run, when firms have a chance to reorganize production. For example, firms might come up with some whole new kind of technology which allows them to get rid of a whole lot of workers if they've got the time and the incentive to do so. So, back to our trick questions. Trick question: what moves demand for labor? The answer is not the wage. Not the wage. The wage changes the quantity of labor demanded, but remember that demand is the amount of labor demanded at any given price, not at one specific price. So what sort of factors could change the demand for labor at every price, at every wage which would be paid? One factor, for example, is new technology. Historically, going back a couple of centuries now, there's been a major fear that the development of new technology would diminish the demand for labor and drive down wages for all workers. Well, this may have been plausible sort of in the middle of the 19th century, but now we've had about 2 centuries of major technological innovation, And the real lesson seems to be that technology causes labor to be moved and displaced from one industry to another. Certain industries are made obsolete by new technology, but the new technology also helps to create new industries and create jobs. And on average, the use of that new technology makes labor more productive. So the result of the new technology is a shift in the labor market, but it's a shift that results in just about as many jobs, if not more, and also in higher average wages. The changes in demand for different kinds of outputs will also alter the demand for certain kinds of labor. There's a friend of mine, for example, who a few years ago thought that massage therapy was the next big upcoming thing, and he went through a course for massage therapy and became, I think, quite expert at it. But he's not getting hired anywhere because recently demand for massage therapy in his part of the country went down somewhat. You can also think of certain skills like, say, playing the classical violin, where demand for the good or service will determine the extent to which firms are willing to hire, or in that case, orchestras are willing to hire. Ultimately, the willingness of firms to hire workers depends on how much the labor is going to produce. It depends on the productivity of labor. After all, if workers don't produce enough to justify their wage, firms won't hire them. Now, let's think this through in terms of a couple of examples. If workers were producing a lot more than their wage, and don't we all feel one time or another as a worker that we're producing a lot more than our wage, then it should be true in a market that some other firm will come along, hire that worker, and give the worker a raise. Over time, and on average, wages are going to be determined by the value of what labor produces. Now, let's think about supply of labor. Again, supply is a relationship to economists. In this case, supply is a relationship between the wage and the quantity of work supplied or provided by workers. A higher wage would typically mean a higher quantity of labor supplied. Now, at an intuitive level, this should make some sense. A higher wage makes it more attractive to work, and so there'll be a little bit more of a quantity supplied of labor. Precisely how much will an increase in the wage increase the quantity of labor supplied? Well, that depends on our friend, the elasticity of labor supply. For many full-time workers in the economy, and by full-time workers I mean sort of workers who are working about 40 hours a week, labor supply is pretty inelastic. That is, a 10% increase in their wages leads to less than a 10% increase in their work hours. However, many full-time workers don't actually have a lot of ability to adjust their hours of labor, so it's not quite clear whether this is their choice or not. As a first approximation, though, it's probably true to say higher wages don't change the quantity of labor supplied by very much for full-time adult workers. However, for part-time workers, or workers who are providing a secondary income for their family, or teenage workers, labor supply is probably more elastic. That is, for that group, a 10% increase in wages might easily lead to more than a 10% increase in hours of work. Trick question. You should be getting used to my trick questions now. What causes the supply of labor to shift? The answer is not the wage. Wage doesn't cause supply to shift. The labor supply covers a whole range of wages and a whole range of salaries. When the wage changes, the quantity supplied of labor shifts, but the supply itself doesn't move. Now, what sort of factors might affect the supply of labor in a way that would cause the entire labor supply curve to shift? Well, some possibilities might include things like changes in population. As the population gets bigger, there's going to be more labor supplied at any given wage or salary. There can also be shifts in the demographics of a population. For example, when a population is very young, it's typical to believe that, in general, those workers might not be highly attached to the workforce. Or if the population, much of it is exceptionally old, again, there's a sense that many people might be on the edge of retirement. But if a lot of population is sort of right in the middle of their peak earning years, kind of that period from maybe 30 up to 55, that's a group where, with that demographics, the population is going to have a pretty good supply of labor for any given wage level. Now, another difference could be shifts in social expectations about who is expected to work. For example, in the 1970s, there was a massive entry of women into the paid workforce. Many women who'd been working in the household sector decided, in one reason or another, to go off and get paid jobs. That was a dramatic shift in the supply of labor the economy had at every given wage or price. There are many different types of markets for different types of labor that are all going to have different skills and characteristics. Again, you can think about those in some ways in terms of jobs, like markets for nurses, markets for people who cut hair, markets for engineers, markets for economists. In each market, the equilibrium wage will be determined by where the quantity of labor supplied is equal to the quantity of labor demanded in that particular market. For example, let's think about a given market like the labor market for skilled nurses in a certain metropolitan area. If it was true that the wage was below the equilibrium level, then that low wage means that the quantity demanded is going to be pretty high. The low wage encourages hospitals to hire, but the quantity supplied is likely to be fairly low because of the low wage. A shortage develops. The quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and wages of nurses will be bid up in that local market toward the equilibrium level. What about in that local market if the wage was above the equilibrium level? In that case, then, with that high wage, the quantity supplied is likely to be quite high, but the quantity demanded of nurses may not be as high. Hospitals may try and figure out ways to economize on nurses and hire, rather than skilled nurses, perhaps hire healthcare workers who don't quite get paid as much or have quite that skill set. They may be able to substitute technology for nurses in some cases. So in that situation, the quantity supplied is high, the quantity demanded is perhaps not as high. There'll be a surplus of skilled nurses trying to get jobs. And over time, the wage will tend to fall in that labor market or not rise as much for a time. Again, equilibrium happens when you hit the situation where quantity demanded and quantity supplied within that market are equal to each other. And that'll be the balancing point where one doesn't expect the wages to change dramatically. Now, with this sort of supply and demand for labor framework in our minds, let's now contemplate a few different applications of this framework. Other applications are going to come up in later lectures, like when we talk about inequality of income or unemployment. Those are outcomes of labor markets in some ways. But here I want to focus on some things that are specific to the supply and demand framework. The labor market can offer some useful insights into policy issues like the minimum wage, the effect of labor unions, discrimination in labor markets, and how to think about employee benefits. Those are the four issues I want to try and walk through here. Again, my emphasis is not so much on drawing conclusions about these, but in how one might think about these issues as you talk about them and as you discuss them. So, minimum wage first. There are perennial arguments. Since the 1930s, when a minimum wage was first adopted at the national level, there are perennial arguments over whether to raise the minimum wage and how much to raise the minimum wage. What is a minimum wage exactly? A minimum wage is a law that all workers must be paid a certain hourly wage. Thus, it's a price floor. It's a price floor in the sense that, by law, an employer cannot pay less than that amount. And according to the arguments about price floors that were developed in Lecture 4, one would expect that it would lead to a situation where there's a shortage of employers willing to offer low-skilled jobs. Lots of people will be willing to supply their labor at the minimum wage, but perhaps not so many firms will be willing to hire at that minimum wage. And indeed, there's some evidence that about a 10% rise in the minimum wage can often lead to 1 or 2% more unemployment for low-skilled workers. But that effect, that 1 or 2%, is really quite small. And in some studies, the effect is zero, that the increase in the minimum wage is not observed to lead to any decrease in the unemployment rate or in the employment rate for low-skilled workers. This suggests that in the United States, at least, the minimum wage is not being set at a really, really high level above the equilibrium wage. If the minimum wage is way above the equilibrium wage, we should start to run into that problem where lots and lots of people want to work at that minimum wage, but there's not much willingness to hire them. If the minimum wage is pretty much at the wage that would prevail anyway, or maybe just a little bit above it, then it's not going to create a whole lot of unemployment. And that seems to be more the situation that the US economy has experienced over time, as the minimum wage has been gradually increased. The public policy of the minimum wage, however, is complicated, because like everything else, it involves trade-offs. Let me try and offer some trade-offs to make both advocates and opponents of a higher wage uncomfortable. Here's an insight aimed at opponents of a higher minimum wage to think over. Let's say that a 20% rise in the minimum wage leads to 4% fewer jobs for low-skilled workers, like some of the evidence says. But if it leads to 4% fewer jobs, that also means it leads to a pay raise for 96% of low-skilled workers. Now, remember that many people in low-skilled jobs don't work all year round. So, let's say that the effect of a higher minimum wage is that low-skilled workers work 4% fewer hours in a year, but they get 20% higher pay for the hours that they do work. In other words, accept the argument, I'm accepting the argument, for the sake of the argument, I'm accepting the argument that the minimum wage will reduce the number of jobs. But even if it reduces the number of jobs or the number of hours available for low-skilled workers, it could still make many low-skilled workers better off, because they would be working fewer hours at a higher wage. So think about it a little. Does that make the minimum wage a good idea or a bad one? There's a trade-off involved. On the other side, here's a bit of history to make supporters of a higher minimum wage perhaps just a little bit uncomfortable. When the minimum wage was first passed at the federal level in 1938, sort of at the tail end of the Great Depression, the reason it was passed was a fear that jobs were going to leave the North and go to low-wage workers in the South. There was a real fear that the minimum wage was necessary to protect workers in the North from millions of low-skilled black workers who were out of jobs in the South. When the minimum wage was enacted, it had an enormous effect in the South because average wages in the South were much lower. It put millions of low-skilled black workers out of work in the South in order to protect the jobs and the salary of white workers in the North. And it was intended to do so. I mean, if you look at the voting lines, you can see that that was clearly the intention. So, does that make you a little more comfortable or a little less comfortable with thinking about the minimum wage? Whenever you think about a price floor, there are always alternative policies available for boosting the income of low-wage workers. Those alternative policies could work with the forces of supply and demand and not risk the same problems as raising the minimum wage especially high. For example, what are some of the alternative policies for low-wage workers? Here are several different ways to think about doing it. One would be to increase government training programs for low-skilled workers. That would both raise the skills of workers who got the additional skills, raise the wages of those workers who get the additional skills, or for the rest of the low-skilled workers, there wouldn't be as many of them. And since there aren't as many of them, that would, in a way, tend to reduce their supply, which should tend to drive up their wages as well. Another possibility would be to have a government program to hire unskilled workers and to subsidize firms in hiring low-skilled workers. Yet another approach would be to subsidize low-paid workers directly. There's actually a tax credit now called the Earned Income Tax Credit. It essentially gives low-paid workers an extra 40 cents for every dollar they earn up to about $10,000. That amount moves year by year. But that increases the incomes of low-skilled workers according to how much they work, without imposing a burden on employers to pay that higher wage themselves. Let's think about the next issue. The next issue is labor unions. I found that people have really strong feelings on both sides of labor unions. And I've been a labor union member, actually, as a newspaper writer for a while, although I haven't been the last few years. So the basic bottom line everyone wants to know, are labor unions good or are labor unions bad? And just a little bit of thought suggests that the answer to this is not obvious or straightforward. Think about some basic facts. Lots of European countries have extremely high unionized workforces compared to the United States. Countries like the United Kingdom or Italy often have 40% or more of their workforce belonging to a labor union. Some of the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Denmark have 70 or 80% of their workforce in a labor union. Now, of course, these economies have their issues and they have problems like all economies, but There's just no denying that those sorts of economies do provide a standard of living that is quite high by world standards. They haven't been crippled and dragged down to a Latin American or an African standard of living because they have a highly unionized workforce. The US had 1/3 of its workforce unionized in the 1950s, and the US economy grew quite well in the 1950s and quite well into the 1960s. Now the US labor force only has about 13% of the workforce unionized, so there's been an enormous decline. Labor unions basically serve just two functions, or they could serve two functions, two alternative functions. One function is that a labor union can just threaten. It can threaten and say, keep wages high or we strike, keep wages high or we strike. A very militant union might take that position. If the union does take that approach, employers will, over time, find ways to conserve on union labor. They'll find ways to use machinery, they'll find ways to buy stuff from other firms, and in general, the size of the union will diminish over time. I think to some extent that's what happened with steelworkers unions and the auto workers unions in the US. The other possibility for unions is that a union could help in building better communication in the workplace, and ultimately in building a more productive workforce. There are all sorts of things like apprenticeships and daycare and giving labor a voice and giving workers an incentive to work hard and making them feel like they're part of the organization that a union can help implement. And in helping to implement those things can help the productivity of firms. That model, for example, is applied pretty well in Germany and a certain number of other European countries. Now, most unions have elements of both of these. It's sort of like a Jekyll and Hyde personality. Sometimes they're militant and they don't care, all they want is higher wages, and other times they're a voice for labor that helps integrate labor into the decisions that are made about production in an economy. So I think the question of whether unions are good or bad is way too simple. It's a question of how unions behave. Although I do think that as unions continually diminish in size in the US, I do wonder sometimes if at least a potentially valuable voice for labor isn't being lost or muted. Third issue I wanted to talk about, labor market discrimination. In economic terms, labor market discrimination occurs when an equally qualified person is turned down for a job or paid less because of their gender or race or some factor like that. In our framework, we would say that demand for the labor of specific groups is less because of gender or race. But in thinking about discrimination in an economic perspective, it's useful to remember that discrimination comes in many different shapes, and in some cases, markets might even fight discrimination. For example, let's think about different sorts of discrimination that might occur. Let's say, for example, that workers from certain groups or certain genders are paid less because they're less productive. And in turn, they're less productive because they were discriminated against earlier in life. For example, perhaps they had inadequate schooling, or perhaps society discouraged people from taking certain career paths earlier on. Now, in that way, the low market wages that group receives are passing along the bad news in a way that discrimination occurred earlier. But the employers aren't the ones doing the discriminating. The employers are paying people what they produce. They're just providing the bad news that discrimination had already happened. Here's another scenario for discrimination. Maybe workers are equally productive in the same job, but some workers are paid less than others. Now, if this happens, it makes more sense to say it's the employers who are doing the discriminating, and we really need to go after the employer discrimination in an aggressive way. But if workers are paid less than they produce, if some workers are paid less than they produce, then it would seem like some non-discriminatory employer would find that worker to be pretty attractive and be able to give them a raise and hire them, because after all, they're producing more than they're getting paid. In that way, being a non-discriminatory employer means you can attract all of the really good workers who are discriminated against by other employers. Being non-discriminatory can actually earn you additional profit in this scenario, and the market can help fight against a certain kind of discrimination. In yet another scenario, markets might reinforce discrimination. Let's say, for example, that the customers of a certain firm are bigoted, and they don't want to deal with workers from a certain ethnic group, or they don't want to deal with workers of a certain gender in a certain job. Or let's say that most of the workers in the workforce are bigoted, and if they are forced to work with members of the undesired group, then the workers are going to have low morale and low productivity. Now, in that case, a profit-maximizing firm will have to act as a mechanism for reproducing discrimination in the workforce. Because when it tries to please its customers, when it tries to please its workers, it will discriminate. That's what its customers and its existing workers want. Yet another discrimination scenario. Last one. Consider the problem if discrimination happens in the form that workers have the same skills, but they get sent into different jobs with different pay. This is often the scenario with gender discrimination that they call the pink-collar ghetto, that women get funneled into certain kinds of jobs, perhaps secretarial jobs, that have no chance of advancement, whereas men get funneled into jobs that might have a similar skill level, but do have some potential for advancement. Now, in that case, it's hard to compare workers in the same job because within secretaries or within other jobs, there isn't discrimination. The discrimination happens by being funneled into separate jobs. In that situation, perhaps the right answer is to break down those sorts of barriers and get more free flow of genders and races between jobs. But my overall point in thinking about discrimination is that discrimination isn't just one phenomenon. It can happen at different points. It can happen in different characteristics of the labor market. It can happen with customers or with workers or with all kinds of different incentives. And so when you're thinking about how to fix discrimination, it's not enough just to blame the employer. You have to think about what sort of discrimination is occurring and why it's occurring, and then go after that in a somewhat direct way. Last issue. Let's think a little bit about employee benefits. Employees often like to think about shifting some costs to their employers. There's often a sense that employees will be better off if they get their employer to pay for their health care benefits. Or employees are better off because half of their Social Security contribution is made by their employer. Or they'd be better off if their employer offers them some benefit like daycare or more vacation or something like that. But you know something? Whatever the accounting game your mind is playing here really doesn't make any difference to the employer. When an employer thinks about